Hello everyone, my name's Madeleine Campbell and I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about how we teach ethics across the courses at the RVC and some of the subject matter which we cover. I teach human-animal interactions and ethics here at the RVC and I teach across the whole span of courses. So I teach on the BVetMed course, but also on the Bachelor of Science courses and on the Master of Science courses, and in fact also on the nursing courses. So ethics is an important component of all of the professional qualifications which we offer here at the RVC, and also for everyone who's planning to work in any animal or animal related industry. Why is that so? Well, first of all, an understanding of ethics is really important to safeguard animal welfare. And it's also really important to try to ensure that veterinary treatment of animals is ethical. And that's particularly true as technology develops, as what we can do becomes really more and more extraordinary from a scientific point of view. Then there's a big question associated with that of whether we should be doing something just because we can, whether it's really in the animal's best interests. And then, of course, because vets and allied professionals operate within society, it's really important that we consider the license which society gives us. In other words, the fact that society by law allows us to do things which other members of society aren't allowed to do, like to operate upon an animal, and that we constantly review our veterinary procedures in the light of society's changing attitudes. And then finally, we really want to provide our students with a framework for analysing ethical dilemmas, because we know that ethical dilemmas, once you go out to work, whatever type of work you go into, can be really stressful. And we hope that by teaching students whilst they're here, by teaching them methods that they can use to address these ethical dilemmas, we can help to reduce that stress for them. So on this slide you can see examples of some of the kind of things we talk about in relation to ethics on the BVetMed course. We talk about whether techniques that have historically been used in veterinary medicine are still ethically justifiable. So if you look at the picture on the top left here, you can see a horse's legs, and those horse's legs have got kind of lines across them. And what those lines have been caused by is a technique known as bar firing, which is essentially just applying a red hot piece of iron to a horse's legs in an attempt to cure a tendon injury. So it's essentially an old-fashioned method that was thought to help provoke healing within a tendon. Now, although for years it was a widely accepted and widely used method of so-called treatment, now with the scientific evidence that's become available to us, we know that there's actually no evidence base for that at all, and that it doesn't help the tendon heal, and of course it does cause harm and pain to the horse. So in a modern view, we would say that kind of technique is no longer ethically justifiable. Then on the other side, we consider really cutting-edge techniques. So on the top right side of the slide, you can see a cat, and it's got two prosthetic limbs fitted there, quite like those limbs you see sometimes on para-athletes who are running. And we discuss whether this is in the cat's best interest, whether, however technologically advanced and extraordinary this veterinary surgery is, it's actually the best thing for the cat, or whether there might be other treatment options that we could offer, which the cat would effectively prefer. And then we talk about things that are used very commonly in veterinary medicine, such as neutering. So you can see a picture here of my old dog, Ollie, who had been castrated, and we discuss whether routine neutering of animals is in fact a good thing from an individual animal's point of view, or whether when we're doing that for population control purposes, we're actually causing a harm to an individual animal. We talk about the interaction between an animal and their owner, and whether the interests of the owner sometimes conflict with the interests of the animal, and how as veterinary professionals we can manage that kind of situation. And then we talk about really the huge question of what do we mean by an animal, and when do we need to be worried about ethics? So should we be considering, for example, embryos as well as kind of live, fully formed animals? Should we be worrying about techniques such as cloning or genetic editing? And then we talk about the impact of humans upon animals and how there may be an interaction between riding horses, for example, and health and welfare of those animals. I also teach ethics on some other courses. So, for example, I teach on a Home Office licensing course. And in that course, we think very much about how we justify the use of animals in medical science, what we can do to improve animals' lives, what limitations we should set on that use, whether it's justifiable to use some animals perhaps but not others, how we can try and reduce harms by using animals such as insects rather than animals such as dogs, for example. And all the ethical justifications kind of surrounding putting human needs above animal needs and our use of animals in order to try and improve human medicine and improve the quality of human lives. All of those issues are obviously quite contentious, and there'll be a lot of different views within the group whom I'm teaching about whether or not those kinds of uses of animals are or should be acceptable. What has all of this got to do with you as a prospective student at the RVC? Well, ethics is relevant to anyone who's undertaking any course at the RVC. In fact, everyone who's working at the RVC as well. Animal ethics is relevant to everyone who's working with or interacting with animals in society. It's very likely, if you get an interview, that you would be asked about ethical issues in the interview, so it's certainly worth having thought about them a little bit beforehand. And you will certainly face ethical issues in your everyday working lives after you graduate, whether that be within the veterinary or the allied professions or in the animal industries, or even, in fact, if you work in completely different industries such as catering, there will still be issues to do with animal ethics underlying your everyday decisions. Ethics is a little bit different from other subjects which are taught at the RVC because there is no right answer. So it's not a science subject. It's a subject all to do with discussion and points of view and ways of debating things. So although there are certainly better and worse ways of setting out about how we try to work out an answer, there is not a correct answer. And the important thing is to be able to justify your own opinion and to make a clear argument in favour of it, whilst also always listening, of course, with consideration to other people's opinions as well. We all have choices in our everyday lives, and so I just wanted to show you now a few examples of that, perhaps to give you something to think about when you go away from this virtual open. We have a lot of choices about what we eat, and how we choose what we eat depends upon a combination of our ability to afford it and of our own personal views about the way in which it's produced. So you might, for example, choose to buy organic produce because you like the idea that things have been produced without a lot of chemicals and fertilizers and so forth. You might choose to buy vegan food because you don't want to be eating animal products. You might choose to buy food which has been produced from animals which are kept in extensive circumstances or in more intensive circumstances, like these feedlot cattle which you can see on the right of this slide. You might choose to try and buy products which are labelled with the fair trade label because you think that's a good way to be using your purchasing power to promote equality in the world. And you might think a lot about the impact of what you buy on the environment, for example, the air miles, and whether you're buying produce which has been flown in from the other side of the world or whether you choose to buy something which has been produced more locally. We have a lot of choices actually about what pets we keep and whether we think that's ethically justifiable or not. So would you think it's justifiable, for example, to keep a dog as a pet? Would you keep a raccoon as a pet? Would you keep a bird, a caged bird, as a pet? Would you keep a tiger as a pet? I remember when I was small seeing a woman who had a pet leopard on a beach in the south of France. Well, that's probably not the kind of thing we'd see nowadays because attitudes have really changed. Would you personally keep a brachycephalic dog as a pet, or would you choose one with healthier conformation? And how would you keep those pets? So, for example, in Switzerland, it's illegal to own just one guinea pig because they're prone to loneliness. But we don't have a similar law in this country. So although we have codes of practice sitting behind the Animal Welfare Act, the laws between different countries are different. And so it's worth thinking about whether you think it's reasonable to keep a particular animal and then the way in which you think it's reasonable to keep it. What about choices around the way in which humans use animals for our entertainment? So on this slide, there's a few examples for you to consider. Do you think it's reasonable, for example, to use bulls for bullfighting? Do you think it's reasonable to keep large cats in zoos? Do you think it's reasonable to keep large mammals in aquaria or so-called wildlife parks where people can go and watch them do tricks and jump through hoops and all of that kind of thing? Do you think it's reasonable to keep tigers in circuses? There's recently been a ban in the UK on using wild animals in circuses. Do you think it's reasonable to use dogs to do agility competitions? You know, that's done for our entertainment. Is not something which the dogs would choose to do of their own accord. So is that a reasonable thing to be asking? Are we really confident that the dogs enjoy doing it? Or actually, are we putting our own kind of needs for entertainment above their best interests? I'm just asking all of these as questions for you to think about. Of course, there's a lot of discussion around the use of animals in medical science and whether or not that's ethically justified, and that's something which people have very strong opinions on, one way or the other. So do you think it's reasonable, for example, to use mice to test a human disease on? Are we prepared to sacrifice animals, to deliberately cause them harms in order to try and improve the quality of life and the health of human beings? And ultimately, of course, your own answers to these questions which I'm posing will depend upon your personal beliefs. So it may depend upon your religion, and we know that certain religions treat certain animals very differently. It might depend upon your view of animal rights. It might depend upon your belief about what we should eat and what we shouldn't eat. It might actually also depend upon a medical need for you to avoid certain foods. And it might depend upon your views about the interactions between humans and animals, upon the way in which we treat animals differently. So if you think of a rat, society as a whole treats a rat very differently depending on whether it's a laboratory rat or a pet rat, or a wild rat causing a problem in someone's building. So the way in which you individually behave will depend upon your belief about all of those kind of issues. Science lets us influence the world around us. There's no doubt about that. It's an obvious statement. It influences everything from our ability to grow food, to our pollution of the environment, to our ability to explore space, through, of course, to our control of diseases, which is obviously something at the top of all of our minds at the moment. And many inventions and medicines have been made possible because of science and scientific research. So we can think about going to Mars or to the moon. We can think about the ability to control animal populations or follow animal populations, or to spray crops using clones. We can think about extraordinary inventions such as prosthetic hands. We can think about inventions which we take for granted, such as antibiotics. And if you look very carefully at this picture on the bottom right of this eagle, you can see, in fact, it's got a false beak. It's had a 3D printed beak made specially to fit it, to replace a beak which got damaged. So science underwrites all of this, but alongside the science always these ethical questions about whether we should be doing things and our impact upon animals, upon the environment, upon society, and upon ourselves. Here are a few questions for you to think about, just to finish up with. Do you think it's possible to clone animals? If so, what does that mean? What is cloning? and how do we do it? Do you think it's possible to change the DNA to alter the genome, the genetic part of animals? If so, what does that mean and how do we do it? Well, the answer to both of those questions actually is yes, these things can be done in animals. So if it's possible in animals, do you think it would be possible to do these things in humans, to clone humans or to alter their genetic makeup, to alter their genome? Yes, all of those techniques are possible not only in animals but also in humans. And so the question I want to leave you with is, if those things are possible in animals and they are possible in humans but not currently allowed in humans, then why do you think we don't do them in humans, and should those things be possible in the future? That's just something for you to think about, and I hope it gives you an idea of the kind of breadth and span of the subjects which we cover on the ethics part of the courses at the RVC. Thanks for joining.